A catastrophic explosion tore through the port side of the Stellar Guardians, its force akin to a miniature nuclear event. At his workstation, Kevin Johnson, a human engineer, struggled to maintain his balance as the ship's artificial gravity wavered violently. Tools and equipment floated haphazardly in erratic paths across the expansive engineering bay. The piercing cry of the warning klaxon echoed through the corridors, its desperate pitch intermingling with the sharp hissing of ruptured pressure seals. A status report came crackling over the intercom, the voice of Captain Reynolds, steady despite the evident pandemonium. Residential Sector B is entirely compromised. We've lost 30% of our living quarters. Kevin narrowed his eyes at the damage readings flashing across the holographic display. Environmental systems are barely holding in the remaining sections, Captain, but casualties? None to be reported. Emergency protocols ensured everyone got out in time. A wave of relief washed over him, the ship's AI having done its job, effectively sealing off the affected zones before the catastrophic decompression could claim any lives. Engineering, I require solutions immediately. Before Kevin could respond, a new voice cut through the comm channel, precise, cool, and unmistakably non-human. Captain, this is engineering expert, Serafina. The human's assessment is incomplete. We're experiencing structural integrity loss in adjacent sections at an alarming rate. Kevin, his irritation rising, interjected, I can see the numbers. With urgency, he added, if we reroute power from the tertiary systems it will save the ship. The captain's firm voice sliced through their developing argument. Enough. You two are my best engineers. I don't care about standard operating procedures or unconventional approaches right now. I only care about keeping this ship intact. Work together and resolve this issue. Kevin pushed himself away from his console and faced his new partner. Serafina stood rigidly at her workstation, her lavender skin catching the emergency lighting in a manner that would have been beautiful if not for the obvious disdain etched into her posture. As with all Xylosian beings, she possessed a kind of ethereal grace, but her features were sharp, angled, and designed for maximum efficiency rather than aesthetics. Look, Kevin began, running a hand through his dark, disheveled hair. We can argue about methodology later. At the moment, your unconventional solutions have already caused 3 system failures this month. Serafina countered sharply, the Xylosian Engineering Corps does not endorse such improvisation. Kevin retorted, well, we're not on Xylos, are we? He moved towards her station, pointing at the structural analysis displayed on the screen. See these stress patterns? Traditional repairs won't hold. We need to think outside the box. Serafina's luminous eyes narrowed. The box exists for a reason, Engineer Johnson. Before the argument escalated further, Lieutenant Davies burst into the engineering bay. We've got bigger problems with the residential sectors. We're implementing emergency quarters redistribution. You two are sharing room 2187. What? They both spoke simultaneously, causing Kevin to smirk and Serafina to scowl. 1 room, 1 bunk, Lieutenant Davies continued, already backing towards the door. Captain's orders, no exceptions. Figure it out after you save our ship. As the lieutenant disappeared, Kevin turned back to the engineering console, trying to ignore the thought of sharing such cramped quarters with the Ice Queen beside him. About that power reroute, Serafina's fingers danced across her interface. The statistical probability of system failure is far too high. Kevin scoffed, sometimes you have to trust your gut. She replied dryly, I fail to see how your digestive organs factor into engineering calculations. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Kevin couldn't help but chuckle. It's an expression. It means. A violent shudder ran through the ship, cutting him off. New warning lights flashed across their displays. Hull breach in Section C, Serafina announced, her professional composure slipping for a moment to reveal genuine concern. Kevin was already moving, pulling up the ship's schematics. We can seal it, but I'll need access to the manual override controls. Serafina pointed out, those are sealed behind 3 feet of reinforced bulkhead, which is currently warping under spatial pressure. Then we'll have to get creative, Kevin declared, grabbing his tool belt. Serafina hesitated, her internal struggle visible in the slight twitch of her silver finger. "Your plan violates every protocol in the book," she stated. "I know, but unless you've got a better idea that works in the next 3 minutes." Another tremor rocked the ship. Serafina's posture shifted subtly, resignation warring with determination. "Very well. But I will document every violation." "Wouldn't expect anything less," Kevin muttered, heading for the access tunnel without waiting to see if she followed. Her footsteps behind him, precise and measured even in crisis, told him all he needed to know. They had a ship to save, protocols be damned, and afterward, well, that narrow bunk in room 2187 was going to make for an interesting end to an already chaotic day. As they hurried through the corridors, Kevin couldn't resist a jab. "You know, for someone who hates improvisation, you're pretty quick on your feet." Serafina replied stiffly, "Movement efficiency is taught at the academy, unlike your human tendency to rush blindly into danger." "Admit it, you're enjoying this a little," Kevin challenged. "I do not enjoy anything, Engineer Johnson. I perform my duties." "Call me Kevin," he said, pausing briefly at a junction to check the schematics on his wrist display. "And I've seen you smile when your calculations work out perfectly. That small one, at the right corner of your mouth." The look she gave him could have frozen plasma. "You watch my mouth only professionally." He grinned, then pointed to a maintenance shaft. "Through here. Hope you're not claustrophobic." Serafina pushed past him into the shaft, her movements deliberately graceful. "Xylosian do not experience irrational fears." "No, then why are you hesitating?" "I am calculating the optimal path, considering spatial constraints," she responded, her tone perfectly even. "Sure you are," Kevin muttered, following her, trying not to notice how the tight space forced them into such close proximity. "Just remember, my irrational human instincts are about to save this ship." She replied coolly, "That remains to be proven." As they crawled through the ship's arteries towards the hull breach, Kevin found himself oddly enjoying their banter. Sure, she was rigid, arrogant, and likely documenting his every breath as a violation of some regulation, but there was something fascinating about the way she approached problems, a precision that might actually complement his more intuitive style. If they survived the next few minutes, sharing quarters with her might not be the worst punishment the universe had devised. Challenging, yes. Potentially explosive, definitely, but boring? Never. The breach alarm screamed louder as they approached their target. Time to put their differences aside and see if fire and ice could work together without destroying each other in the process. "Ready to break some rules?" Kevin asked, pulling out his tools. Serafina's response was to produce a data pad and begin recording. "For the official record, I protest this entire approach," she stated. "Noted. Now help me save our ship." The maintenance shaft narrowed as they drew closer to the hull breach, forcing them to crawl single file. Kevin tried to focus on the task ahead, rather than the way Serafina's lavender skin seemed to shimmer in the emergency lighting. Each of her movements was fluid and precise. "The manual override is behind this panel," he said, pulling out a sonic wrench. "We'll have about 30 seconds once I remove it." Serafina corrected him, 28.4 seconds. Her luminous eye scanned the readout on her data pad. "And your proposed method will damage the panel's integrity by approximately." Kevin yanked the panel free, a blast of pressurized air rushing past them, warning lights bathed the cramped space in crimson. This highlighted the angular planes of Serafina's face as she shot him a look that could have melted durasteel. That was not the approved removal procedure. "Less criticizing, more helping," Kevin retorted. He reached into the exposed circuitry, his fingers dancing over the complex array of neural interfaces. "I need you to monitor the power fluctuations while I redirect the." "Your hand positioning is incorrect," Serafina pressed against him in the tight space, her cool fingers wrapping around his wrist. "The optimal connection point is here." The touch sent an unexpected shiver through him. Her skin was cooler than a human's, but not unpleasantly so. "I thought Xylosian avoided physical contact." "This is professional guidance," she said, but she did not immediately remove her hand. Of course, Kevin smirked, even as he followed her adjustment. "Purely professional. Unlike humans, we do not attach emotional significance to necessary physical proximity," she declared. Says the woman still holding my wrist. Serafina withdrew her hand as if burned, the lavender skin darkening slightly around her cheeks. "Focus on the task, Engineer Johnson." "Kevin," he reminded her, working faster now. "And I am focused. I can multitask, you know? That chaotic human trait you find so inefficient." The ship groaned around them, metal stress points screaming under the strain. Serafina's data pad beeped urgently. "Power levels are becoming critical. We have 14 seconds before." "Got it," Kevin said, making the final connection. The override panel hummed to life and the emergency bulkhead slammed shut, sealing off the breach. The warning klaxons fell silent, replaced by the normal hum of the ship's systems. He turned to Serafina, ready to celebrate, but the tight space made the movement awkward. They ended up nose to nose, her cool breath mingling with his. "That," she said softly, "was reckless, dangerous, and completely against protocol. But effective," she admitted, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw that slight smile he'd mentioned earlier. The moment stretched, neither of them moving despite the cramped position. Then, Serafina's data pad chirped, breaking the spell. "Captain Reynolds requires our presence in engineering," she announced, already backing away with that inherent grace. "And I have 17 violations to report." "Only 17? I'm losing my touch." Kevin followed her out of the shaft, trying not to notice how her form-fitting engineering uniform highlighted the subtle variations in her lavender skin tone. "Want to grab some coffee first? I hear the mess hall is still intact." "Xylogen do not consume stimulants," she responded. "Right, too emotional, too inefficient." But there was something in her tone, a lightness that hadn't been there before. "However, I would not object to reviewing the incident over a nutrient supplement." "Wow, that's the most romantic thing anyone ever said to me." "I did not intend." She stopped, noticing his grin. "You are engaging in that human behavior called teasing. Guilty as charged. Add it to your violation report." They emerged into the main corridor, where crew members were still dealing with the aftermath of the initial explosion. Serafina paused, her expression becoming serious again. "We still need to address the matter of shared quarters." "Don't worry," Kevin said, starting toward engineering. "I promise to keep my chaotic human tendencies to my side of the bunk." "There are no sides. The sleeping surface is exactly 76.2 centimeters wide." "Sounds cozy." Serafina's stride faltered slightly. "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Creating unnecessary tension through suggestive verbal patterns." Kevin laughed. "Trust me, if I was trying to create tension, you'd know it." She studied him with those luminous eyes, as if trying to decode a particularly complex equation. "Humans are unnecessarily complicated. Part of our charm. Come on, let's go report our successful protocol violations to the captain. Then you can explain to me exactly how Xylogen handles shared sleeping arrangements." "We don't." "First time for everything." As they walked to engineering, Kevin couldn't help but notice that despite her complaints about human inefficiency, Serafina matched his pace perfectly. Maybe there was hope for their forced partnership after all. If nothing else, the next few days promised to be interesting, assuming they didn't kill each other first, or worse, actually start enjoying each other's company. Captain Reynolds' debriefing lasted longer than necessary, largely due to Serafina's insistence on detailing every regulation they'd broken. Kevin leaned against the engineering console, watching her lavender fingers gesture precisely as she outlined each violation. Furthermore, Engineer Johnson's unorthodox approach to the manual override system could have resulted. "But it didn't," Kevin interrupted. "In fact, our solution saved 3 adjacent sections from structural collapse." Serafina's luminous eyes narrowed. "The potential risks were worth it," Captain Reynolds cut in. Good work, both of you. Unconventional but effective. Now, about your new quarters arrangement. Already sorted, Kevin said quickly, ignoring Serafina's sharp look. We're professionals. We can handle it. The captain's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Just try not to kill each other. We need you both functional. She paused. An engineer, Serafina, perhaps fewer violation reports tomorrow? Serafina's posture stiffened. As you wish, Captain. Though I must note that such leniency towards procedural violations. Dismissed, Reynolds said firmly. As they left engineering, Kevin couldn't resist. So, Rumi, want to check out our new accommodations? We have repair diagnostics to complete, which we can do from our quarters. The workstation there links to all ship systems. Our temporary quarters, Serafina corrected. Right, very temporary. Just us, one desk, one bunk, for however long it takes to repair the residential sector. Her lavender skin darkened slightly around her cheeks again. You seem unusually focused on the sleeping arrangements. Just being practical. Something you appreciate, right? They reached room 2187 and Kevin entered the access code. Ladies first, he said with a smirk. The door slid open to reveal a space that made cramped seem generous. A narrow bunk jutted from one wall, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. A small workstation occupied the opposite corner, with barely enough floor space between to stand. Serafina surveyed the room with the same intensity she'd used on the hull breach. This is significantly below minimum space requirements for 2 crew members. Cozy, isn't it? Kevin stepped in, deliberately brushing past her. Don't worry, I don't snore much. Sleep habits are irrelevant. We will establish a rotation schedule. In this temperature, the environmental controls were still struggling after the accident, leaving the room notably cool. We'd freeze taking turns unless, he grinned. Your Xylosion are immune to cold too. Our body temperature is naturally lower than humans, she said, but he noticed she'd wrapped her arms around herself. We adapt. Sure, or we could be practical and share body heat. That would require prolonged physical contact. Purely professional contact, he echoed her earlier words. For survival. Serafina moved to the workstation, but Kevin caught the slight uptick at the corner of her mouth. I will document your suggestion in my report, along with my 17 other violations, 23 now. She activated the console. Your disregard for personal space is quite consistent. Kevin leaned over her shoulder, close enough to notice that her lavender skin had a faint, pleasant scent, something like ozone and starlight. Just trying to live up to your expectations. She turned, probably to deliver another lecture on proper protocol, but the movement brought their faces inches apart. For a moment, neither spoke. Kevin found himself studying the subtle patterns in her luminous eyes, like distant nebulae caught in crystal. You are doing it again, she said softly. What? Creating unnecessary tension? Maybe the tension is necessary, he straightened up, giving her space for a proper cultural exchange. Of course, of course. Was that amusement in her tone? We should focus on the repair diagnostics, right? Work first, cultural exchange later. Serafina's fingers moved across the console, but he noticed they weren't quite as precise as usual. You are impossible. Improbable, he corrected. Not impossible, there's a difference. I am beginning to understand why you have had 3 previous engineering partners request transfers. And I'm beginning to understand why you're considered the most demanding expert in the Xylosion Corps. Their eyes met again, challenge mixing with something else, something that made the cramped quarters feel even smaller. We have work to do, Serafina said finally. Always do. Kevin moved to the other side of the workstation. But you have to admit, this partnership is going to be interesting. Interesting is not the term I would choose. No? What would you choose? Her expression softened, almost imperceptibly. I believe humans would call it a disaster waiting to happen. Kevin laughed. See? You're learning our expressions already. Next thing you know, you'll be making jokes. Unlikely, but that ghost of a smile was back. Now, about these power fluctuations, they settled into work, but Kevin couldn't help noticing how Serafina seemed to lean slightly closer than necessary when pointing out readings on the screen. Maybe, just maybe, this forced proximity wouldn't be such a disaster after all, though he had a feeling neither of them would be getting much sleep in that narrow bunk. The ship's temperature dropped steadily over the next 12 hours. Kevin watched his breath crystallize in the air as he worked on power distribution calculations at their shared workstation. Beside him, Serafina's fingers moved across her console with their usual precision, though he noticed a slight tremor he hadn't seen before. Environmental control reports another 5-degree drop, she announced, her voice tight. Power reserves are insufficient for proper heating. Notice that. Kevin rubbed his hands together, trying to restore circulation. How's your superior Xylosian physiology handling the cold? We are adaptable, she replied, but her lavender skin had taken on a darker, almost indigo shade that he was beginning to recognize as stress. Right, that's why you're shivering. I am maintaining optimal molecular movement to generate heat. Kevin stood, grabbing the emergency thermal blanket from his kit. Here, your optimal molecular movement isn't cutting it. I do not require. She stopped as he draped the blanket over her shoulders, her luminous eyes widening slightly at the gesture. Basic survival, he said, before she could object. No protocols violated. Your own thermal regulation appears compromised, she observed, watching him return to his station. I'll manage. Serafina was silent for a moment, then shifted the blanket. The surface area is sufficient for 2, if we optimize positioning. Kevin raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we share? I am suggesting efficient resource allocation, she responded, but there was something different in her tone, less clinical, more uncertain. He moved his chair closer, allowing her to spread the blanket over both of them. Their shoulders touched, and he felt her initial tension slowly ease as shared warmth built between them. On Earth, he said after a while, we have this tradition called winter gatherings. Families come together during the coldest months, share meals, tell stories. For thermal efficiency, for connection, community, he chuckled. Though the warmth helps. Xylosian do not gather without purpose. Isn't connection a purpose? She considered this, her profile sharp against the dim emergency lighting. We believe such emotional entanglements cloud judgment. They are inefficient, like my engineering solutions. Precisely, but he caught that ghost of a smile again. Though I must admit your methods have shown unexpected merit. High praise from the Ice Queen herself. Ice Queen, Earth expression for someone cool and distant, he turned slightly, studying her reaction. Though maybe not as accurate as I first thought. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the cold seemed less pressing. Then, a violent shudder ran through the ship, throwing them against each other. A warning, the ship's AI announced, critical failure in the primary power core. Backup systems engaged. Serafina was already pulling up diagnostics. The temperature drop has affected the core's containment field. We have approximately 43 minutes before complete failure. Less, if we can stabilize it. Kevin scanned the readings. We need to get to engineering. The corridors are approaching freezing temperatures. Then we'd better hurry, he said, standing and keeping the blanket wrapped around them both. Unless you'd rather freeze here. She rose gracefully, matching his stance. Your solution involves us walking through the ship sharing a thermal blanket? Got a better idea? Several, all of which violate fewer protocols. But she didn't pull away. Though given the circumstances, you can add it to your report. They made their way through the darkened corridors, pressed together under the blanket. Each step brought them closer, their movements synchronizing out of necessity. Kevin tried to focus on the crisis ahead rather than the way her cool skin seemed to warm wherever they touched. Tell me about Xylos, he said, partly to distract himself. What do you do during your cold season? We do not have seasons. Our environmental systems are perfectly regulated. Sounds boring, he said. She gave him a sidelong look. Efficiency is not meant to be entertaining.
No? Then why are you almost smiling?
A muscular response to temperature fluctuation. Sure, it is. They reached engineering, and Kevin entered the access code. Just like that muscle response when I fixed the hull breach.
Or when I gave you the blanket?
The door slid open, revealing the chaos inside. Warning lights flashed across every console, and the core containment field flickered ominously. This is not the time for your human tendency toward inappropriate flotation, Serafina said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Who's flirting? I'm making scientific observations. Kevin moved to the main console, dragging her with him under the blanket. Like how you leaned slightly closer when you're about to correct my calculations? I do not. Or how your eyes get brighter when you're trying not to laugh at my jokes. Focus, Engineer Johnson. Always am. He pulled up the core schematics on lots of things. They worked in tandem, his intuitive adjustments complementing her precise calculations. The containment field stabilized gradually, their shared warmth under the blanket becoming comfortable rather than necessary. Your solution was, Serafina paused, searching for words, unorthodox, but effective. Just like our partnership. This time, her smile was unmistakable, small but genuine. Perhaps the core's hum returned to normal, and the emergency lights dimmed. They stood close under the blanket, neither moving to separate now that the crisis had passed. You know, Kevin said softly, humans have another tradition for staying warm. More inefficient. Gathering, dancing. Her luminous eyes widened. That would violate at least 12 protocols. I know, he shifted slightly, not quite moving away, but it's excellent for generating heat through movement.
Is this more scientific observation?
Could be, want to test the hypothesis? For a moment, he thought she might actually consider it. Then her professional mask slipped back into place, though not quite as firmly as before. We should check the secondary systems, she said, but she didn't step away. Always working, Kevin grinned. One of these days, I'll teach you about human inefficiency. I believe you already are, she met his gaze directly, most thoroughly. The way she said it sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the blanket. Maybe this disaster was turning out exactly as it should. After stabilizing the core, exhaustion hit them both hard. Kevin felt his vision blur as he stared at the engineering console, the numbers swimming before his eyes. Beside him, even Serafina's perfect posture had begun to slip. Your efficiency has decreased by 37%, she noted, stifling what might have been a yawn. And yours by at least 20, he countered, watching her blink slowly at her screen. We need rest. The temperature in our quarters is still freezing. I know, he saved their work and stood, keeping the thermal blanket around them, but we have options. Serafina's luminous eyes narrowed. If you suggest another Earth tradition, basic survival, he said, trying to keep his tone professional despite his racing heart. Shared body heat is the most efficient solution. She studied him for a long moment, her lavender skin darkening slightly. You are suggesting we share the sleeping surface, bunk, he corrected. And yes, unless you'd prefer to freeze while taking turns. The statistical probability of maintaining adequate body temperature alone is, she paused, calculating, unfavorable. Is that a yes? That is a reluctant acknowledgement of limited options, she replied. But something in her expression softened, though your solution does have certain logical merits. They made their way back to their quarters, still huddled under the blanket. The door slid open to reveal their tiny room, the narrow bunk suddenly seeming much more significant than before. So, Kevin said, breaking the awkward silence, how does Xylosion handle sleeping arrangements? We don't, her voice was quieter than usual. Physical proximity during rest is unprecedented. First time for everything, he tried to keep his tone light. I promise to stick to my side. There are no sides. The surface is 76.2 centimeters wide. I remember, he gestured to the bunk. Ladies first. Serafina hesitated, then moved to the bunk with her characteristic grace. She lay down stiffly, pressed against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Kevin took a deep breath and joined her, trying to maintain some space between them. It was impossible. The moment he settled, they were pressed together from shoulder to hip, the thermal blanket barely covering them both. This is highly irregular, Serafina murmured, but he noticed she didn't pull away. Desperate times, he shifted slightly, trying to find a comfortable position. Try to relax. Your optimal molecular movement is making the whole bunk vibrate. I am perfectly relaxed. Sure, that's why you're as rigid as a support beam. Without thinking, he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. Here, for heat efficiency. She stiffened for a moment, then gradually melted against him. Her skin was cool against his, but not unpleasantly so. The contrast sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. Your heart rate has increased, she observed quietly. Scientific observation. Professional interest, he said, but she pressed closer, her head finding a natural spot against his shoulder. Though your temperature is surprisingly adequate. Kevin chuckled, the sound rumbling through both of them. High praise indeed. Do not become overconfident. Yet her hand came to rest on his chest, fingers splaying over his heart. This is merely a practical solution. Of course. He traced small circles on her back, feeling her shiver. Purely professional. Exactly, her voice was growing drowsy, though your method of heat distribution is unexpectedly effective. I'm full of surprises. She made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. That has become increasingly apparent. They fell silent, the ship's quiet hum mixing with their synchronized breathing. Kevin found himself memorizing every detail, the way her lavender skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, how her body fit against his as if engineered for it, the subtle scent of ozone and starlight that was uniquely her. Kevin, her use of his first name startled him. HM? Perhaps some human inefficiencies have merit. He smiled into the darkness. I'll add that to my report. You do not write reports, she pinched his side lightly. No? Then why are you cuddling? This is not cuddling. This is optimal positioning for heat preservation. Right, very scientific indeed. But she nuzzled closer, her cool breath ghosting across his neck. Though perhaps not entirely unpleasant. Kevin tightened his arm around her, feeling sleep begin to pull at him. Careful, talk like that might make me think you're warming up to me. Impossible. Yet he could feel her smile against his skin. Though the temperature is becoming more tolerable. They drifted off together, professional boundaries blurring in the face of shared warmth and unexpected comfort. Just before sleep took him completely, Kevin heard her murmur something in her native language, soft and musical, like starlight given voice. He made a mental note to ask her about it tomorrow. After all, they had plenty of cold nights ahead to explore this new efficiency. Kevin woke to find himself completely entangled with Serafina. Sometime during their sleep, she had wrapped herself around him like a living blanket. Her lavender skin was luminescent in the dim light of dawn, her head rested in the crook of his neck, one leg thrown over his. Her cool breath tickled his skin. He stayed perfectly still, savoring the moment before her usual rigid control took over. Her hair, typically pulled back in a severe style, had come loose, creating a silvery cascade across his chest. Your heart rate has increased again, she murmured against his neck, making him start. How long have you been awake? Long enough to collect interesting data on human sleep patterns. She didn't move away, which felt significant. You talk in your sleep. Heat crept up his neck. What did I say? Something about beautiful lavender starlight. There was a hint of amusement in her voice. Most inefficient use of rest cycles. I was probably talking about the engine core, he deflected, though his arm tightened around her waist. Of course. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with those luminous eyes. Just as your elevated temperature is purely due to environmental factors. Absolutely, he reached up, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. Very scientific. She caught his hand before he could withdraw it, studying his fingers with intense focus. Humans are unnecessarily warm. Part of our charm. It is distracting, her fingers traced patterns on his palm, sending shivers through him. Makes it difficult to maintain proper cognitive function.
Really?
He grinned. The great Serafine at all distracted by a warm human? I did not say it was pleasant.
No? Then why are you still holding my hand?
She glanced at their intertwined fingers as if surprised to find them that way. Professional curiosity about human physiological responses. For instance, her voice dropped lower when I do this. She traced her cool fingers up his arm, watching his reaction. Kevin's breath caught. Very thorough research indeed. She moved closer, her face hovering above his. Though I require more data. Far be it from me to stand in the way of science, he said. Her lips curved in that ghost of a smile he was growing addicted to. Your assistance is appreciated. The space between them charged with electricity, like the moment before a jump to hyperspace. Kevin reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face. Her skin was cool silk under his palm.
Serafine?
Yes? I'm going to violate about 50 protocols. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers. For a moment, she froze, and he feared he'd miscalculated. Then she melted into him, her cool mouth warming against his, fingers curling into his shirt. The kiss was a fusion of opposites, fire and ice, chaos and order, earth and xylos. When they finally parted, her eyes were glowing brighter than he'd ever seen. She seemed to search for words, a rare occurrence, inefficient. Highly, she traced his bottom lip with one finger. We should collect more data. Kevin laughed, the joy bubbling up unstoppably. Multiple trials for accuracy? Precisely. This time, she kissed him. Precise and thorough, like everything she did, but there was a warmth there that had nothing to do with temperature regulation. The ship's intercom crackled, making them jump apart. Engineering team to the bridge, immediately. Reality crashed back in. They stared at each other, disheveled and breathing hard. We should, Serafine began. Yeah, but neither moved. This complicates our working relationship. Probably, he brushed his thumb across her cheekbone, watching her eyes flutter. Worth it though? She caught his hand, pressing a cool kiss to his palm that sent electricity through his entire body. Perhaps some complications have merit. I'll add that to my report. You still do not write reports. No, he sat up, keeping her close. Day 2 made the Ice Queen melt. She pushed him away, but he caught her smile as she stood to straighten her uniform. You are impossible. Improbable, he corrected, following her. And you like it. I admit nothing. But when he reached for her hand, she let him take it, though further research may be necessary. They headed for the bridge, maintaining professional distance, but unable to quite hide their shared warmth. The ship's problems still loomed, the cold still bit, but something had shifted. Like the first star breaking through a frozen night. And if Serafine's fingers kept brushing his as they walked, well, that was purely for heat efficiency. Probably.